Do you remember that old HP small form factor PC I tried to pair with this GTX 1650 and it ended up being bottlenecked? Well, it's back today. I'm hoping to pair it with something a bit more its speed, this Yeston RX 550. Will it work? Let's find out. You would be forgiven for never hearing of Yeston and thinking this card was just another cheap plastic cooler eBay GPU with a bad BIOS flash that scammers try to flog off as newer cards to uneducated buyers. But this time at least, you're wrong. Yeston's RX 550 has the Polaris 12 GPU die, 4GB of GDDR5 VRAM clocked at 6000 MHz, 128-bit memory bus, 512 shader units, 40-watt power draw, and a clock speed of 1071 MHz, which if you compare that to AMD's spec sheet, almost everything lines up except a lower clock speed and 10-watt less power consumption, but I can accept those differences. This card has its own unique custom pink cooler with a single tiny fan for cooling, and for display on the back we have HDMI and DVI. Unless you were to put this card in a full-size case, there is an extra cable you can use to add a VGA connection, which is pretty neat. I ordered this GPU from AliExpress for about 150 Aussie dollars, which is around the 90 USD mark, and it took about 45 days to arrive, but these are also available on eBay if you would prefer that instead. For a refresher, the HP Z210 small form factor PC we'll be putting it in has an i5 2500 CPU, 8GB of mismatched DDR3, a 1TB 7200 RPM hard drive, a 250GB SSD, and of course a 240W HP OEM power supply, which I discussed in my last video, but I'll do it again about how this may be an issue. The recommended minimum wattage power supply for this GPU is listed as 300W by Yeston and 400W by AMD, which is a fair recommendation as it grants you some overhead for many issues that can arise, such as degradation of the power supply, power ripple, or a sudden power spike, but it is possible to easily run this system with the 240W unit. Now there are higher wattage power supplies out there, but HP motherboards use some proprietary connectors, which means you can only use their specific power supplies, and replacement or higher wattage units are overpriced, unless you can find some cable adapters that will allow you to use a normal power supply. These systems aren't intended to have a graphics card installed in them, so doing so could potentially degrade the system, which may shorten its lifespan, but there is no guarantee that will or won't ever occur, and is completely on a per case basis with many variables. If you are using a small form factor case like this, only low profile cards will fit due to the height limitations of the card, so be sure to read the description of any GPU before you order it, as you do not want to get stuck with the wrong size. One last thing, adding in a low profile graphics card to just any small form factor PC, whether it be Lenovo, Acer, HP, Dell or any other brand, may not always work, as some manufacturers block out add-in cards like graphics or Wi-Fi cards in their BIOS on certain models, so it is best to check forums, manufacturer websites or other YouTube videos to see if a specific model of small form factor PC can support this type of an upgrade. Now all that's out of the way, we should answer the majority of the questions I keep getting on these videos, as I won't be answering any will this fit or will this work sort of compatibility questions in the comments. Let's move on to replacing the GPU. Let's tear out the 1650. Put in the RX 550 and see if it pairs a little better with our aging CPU and a few benchmarks. Before we get into the benchmarks, some of the numbers were recorded using RevaTuner, which displays 1 and 0.1% lows, but in a few games I couldn't get it to work, so I used NVIDIA FrameView, which outputs average, 95th and 99th percentile frames, so keep in mind when reading the numbers, as I will have which software I use listed below the game's title. If you couldn't tell from those benchmark scores and the bit of gameplay in the background, 1080p really isn't achievable with this card, except in the most basic of games, such as Valorant and CSGO, but it was definitely a better gaming experience than the unplayable stuttering that occurred using the 1650 due to the CPU being a bottleneck. Changing the GPU didn't really affect the Cinebench R20 score, which was 982, as opposed to 976 that it originally scored, And the 1 minute render test also rendered out in 7 minutes 16, which is basically the same amount of time with the 1650 installed, so again, don't use this setup for intensive editing sessions. Temperature wise, the CPU idled at 38 degrees and reached a maximum of 70 degrees after 20 minutes of AIDA64, which is much better than the 81 degrees it reached with the 1650 installed. Meanwhile, the GPU idled at 28 degrees and reached a maximum of 78 degrees after 20 minutes of Unigine Heaven 4.0, which again is much better than the 86 degrees the 1650 ran at and attributes to the better temperatures overall. In conclusion, the Yeston RX 550 and i5 2500 is a much better combo and provides a smoother gaming experience in my opinion compared to the 1650, even if you do get fewer frames, which may cause you to need to lower your resolution if you want to hit that magical 60 FPS in some titles. To get a good deal on these small form factor PCs, you sometimes have to be patient and check places like eBay, Facebook Marketplace, or your country specific buy and sell websites every couple of days, as a lot of these are overpriced in my opinion. So show some restraint and don't be afraid to message them with a lower offer. The worst they can say is no, and maybe a few swear words. If you do plan on doing something like this yourself, just keep in mind the small amount of risk I discussed earlier, but the chances of that are very minimal at best, especially using the Yeston RX 550. So go out there, have some fun, and get into PC gaming. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like, and if you really enjoyed it, please consider subscribing for more PC builds and other content in the future. If you have a suggestion, question, or criticism, leave a comment, and thank you very much for watching.